Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andra Gillespie. I'm the director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute. And on behalf of the staff and the visiting fellows of JWJI, I'd like to welcome you to this Race and Difference Colloquium Series session. We're so happy to have you here. And we hope that you voted already, and that if you haven't, that you remember to vote tomorrow. Today, we are happy to have Dr. Matthew Clavin with us, and he's going to be talking about resistance and slavery. Dr. Clavin is an American historian specializing in the history of race and slavery in the United States and the Atlantic world. He's professor of history at the University of Houston and the author of The Battle of Negro Fort, The Rise and Fall of a Fugitive Slave Community, Aiming for Pensacola, Fugitive Slaves on the Atlantic and Southern Frontiers, and Toussaint Louverture and the American Civil War, The Promise and Peril of a Second Haitian Revolution. His work has appeared in Early American Studies, Civil History, the Journal of Southern History, and Slavery and Abolition. He's the recipient of awards and fellowships from the American Antiquarian Society, the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and others. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Matthew Clavin.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you all for joining me today on this eve of a historic election, another historic election in American history. And I find it coincidental and just sort of ideal that my topic today is deeply rooted in the idea of American nationalism and the American ideal and American ideology just in general. So on the eve of a pivotal election in American history, I think it's really a great time to sort of delve into what many people were thinking in the 19th century about some really relevant issues that still resonate among us today. So without further ado, I'll get started, and I don't want to go too long because I really hope this is a thought-provoking presentation, and I look forward to getting some great questions and opening a discussion when it's all said and done. So thank you all. So let's begin. On the 4th of July in 1845, residents of Rockville, Maryland, a small farming village several miles north of Washington, D.C., gathered under a large oak tree to celebrate the anniversary of American independence. It was a memorable day filled with prayer, songs, and speeches, as young and old, rich and poor, urban and rural, remembered the sacrifices of their ancestors and rededicated themselves to the cause of freedom. The diversity of the throng excited one spectator who observed members of every class and condition of society, quote, the farmer, the mechanic, the merchant, the doctor, the lawyer, the clergy, all with their wives, sons, and daughters. The Montgomery Volunteers, the town's militia unit, led a large procession through the town center, quote, with their eagles blazing in the sun, laying their devotions upon the altar of patriotism. Despite the community's enthusiastic response, the euphoria was short-lived. Just days later, Rockville became the focus of national attention when the same Montgomery Volunteers clashed with dozens of fugitive slaves who had absconded from plantations in and around Port Tobacco in Charles County, Maryland, some 50 miles to the south. After passing directly through the nation's capital, the armed bondsmen were continuing their march towards the Pennsylvania border when they encountered the militiamen and other concerned citizens. Following a brief but bloody battle near Rockville, most of the fugitives were arrested and jailed. Some were returned to their owners. Others were put up for sale to the Deep South. Still, the collective effort at freedom was not in vain. In the coming weeks and months, abolitionists rose to the defense of these Black freedom fighters, and on the pages of a variety of northern newspapers, exposed the glaring gap between the rhetoric of the Declaration of Independence, which Americans celebrated every Independence Day, and the reality of slavery. Launching a literary assault on the South's peculiar institution, these anti-slavery crusaders demanded their fellow citizens cease making a mockery of freedom by annually commemorating the abstract concept, and instead, like the fugitive slaves who took flight over the 4th of July weekend, embrace the concrete idea. The significance of the Rockville Rebellion is best understood by situating antebellum opposition to slavery in a national framework. While the Enlightenment inspired belief in universal rights, both encouraged and justified slave resistance and anti slavery activism across the Atlantic world for generations. In the American Republic, the language and symbols of national freedom served similar functions. Slavery alone was enough for enslaved people and their allies to oppose the practice. Even so, in the early United States, both the Declaration of Independence and the annual celebration of its egalitarian ideals were touchstones of a revolutionary political tradition that offered additional inspiration and justification. The Rockville Rebellion is a case in point. The determination of these bondsmen to free themselves from captivity and the speed and intensity with which abolitionists rushed to their defense illuminates how collective efforts at self-liberation could engage enslaved people in political action. Indeed, an analysis of this nearly forgotten incident demonstrates how forceful challenges to the slave system both inflected and reflected the politics of the enslaved. During the 1840s, enslaved people comprised 2/3 of the population of Charles County, Maryland, a large agricultural district south of Washington, D.C. While many labored in the fields and farms of their owners, others worked as servants, sailors, and stevedores for the traders and merchants who coursed the waterways between the nation's capital and the Atlantic Ocean, more than 100 miles to the southeast. Regardless of their occupation, bondspeople in southern Maryland never received compensation for their labor, and in other ways daily suffered the injustices of slavery. Consequently, many of them tried to escape. Fleeing by themselves or in small groups, these absconders rarely attracted public attention outside of the local communities from which they had fled. But in 1845, when scores of them together took flight over the 4th of July weekend and tried to fight their way to freedom, the entire country took notice. Little information on the 4th of July observances in Charles County in 1845 exist. In the county seat, the Port Tobacco Times, a local newspaper, recorded a local gathering to hear an oration by James Ferguson, a recent Yale University graduate and aspiring politician. The crowd also heard a reading of the Declaration of Independence by a well-respected lawyer named Richard Alvey. Following these addresses, revelers retired to the local hotel for a party hosted by the establishment's owner. Undoubtedly, the festivities went beyond those described in the town paper. If 4th of July celebrations across the nation were any indication, Port Tobacco's residents assembled in private and public spaces from the early morning to late night. While some imbibed their favorite drink and others did not, all delighted in a cacophony of sounds, including the shouting of huzzahs, the ringing of church bells, the firing of national salutes, and the explosion of fireworks and cannon. John Adams's dream had come true. In 1776, the founding father encouraged the American people to annually commemorate the birth of the Republic, quote, with pomp, shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of the continent to the other. Now, Adams failed to mention where enslaved people figured in these 4th of July fetes, but the evidence that they understood the significance of this national ritual and associated it with freedom and liberty is convincing. It is widely understood, for example, that slave rebels periodically planned to rise on Independence Day. In 1816, bondsmen in Camden, South Carolina, conspired to commemorate the national holiday by firing the town, seizing the arsenal, and murdering the town's white residents. 2 decades later, Nat Turner revealed of the historic uprising he led in southeastern Virginia, quote, "It was intended by us to have begun the work of death on the 4th of July." Even former slaves recommended Independence Day revolts. On the eve of the Civil War, after Harriet Tubman learned from the radical abolitionist John Brown that he intended to lead a slave army into battle against their southern oppressors, the Moses of her people suggested the 4th of July was the perfect time to, quote, raise the mill. As Tubman's recommendations suggest, rebels were not the only enslaved people who considered the 4th of July a special occasion. Advertisements offering cash rewards for fugitive slaves who absconded on the national anniversary appeared routinely on the pages of Southern newspapers. In Orange County, Virginia, George Penill offered $50 for the return of Rance, a light-skinned 30-year-old captive who, quote, ran away from my farm the 4th July. John McCurrian of Muskogee County, Georgia, promised $200 for the capture and return of Mose, who, quote, ran away on the 4th of July instant. West Point, Georgia's William Reed offered an astounding $300 for the return of the literate and skilled fugitive Bob, who, quote, run away on the 4th day of July last. While none of these fugitives ever testified that their escapes were inspired by Independence Day, the renowned abolitionist author and orator William Wells Brown did. While working on a steamship in St. Louis, Missouri, the enslaved teenager heard an impassioned 4th of July oration by U.S. Senator Thomas Hart Benton, which included a recitation of the Declaration of Independence. Quote, the boy's young heart leapt with enthusiasm as he listened to the burning eloquence of Old Bull Yon, was Benton's nickname. Brown's daughter recalled of her father's reaction that day, quote, from the moment that William heard the speech of Mr. Benton, he resolved that he would be free, end quote. Brown tried to escape from captivity on more than one occasion after hearing Benton's address, and in 1834 finally succeeded. The Declaration of Independence also inspired William and Ellen Craft to free themselves. In the published account of their unusual escape, which involved the husband, William, posing as the servant of his exceptionally light-skinned wife, Ellen, the couple became familiar with the Declaration during their enslavement in Macon, Georgia. Having become fully aware of the idea that all men were created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights, quote, we could not understand by what right we were held as chattels, the two explained in their autobiographical account. Therefore, we felt perfectly justified in undertaking the dangerous and exciting task of running 1,000 miles in order to obtain those rights which are so vividly set forth in the Declaration. Unfortunately, there are no records indicating how enslaved people experienced the 4th of July in Port Tobacco in 1845, or whether they heard the public reading of the Declaration in the town square and hence resolved to be free. What is recorded is that the next day, as many as 75 of them, under the leadership of a, quote, powerful and muscular Negro named William Wheeler, agreed to abscond. Arming themselves with scythes, knives, bludgeons, clubs, and, quote, some guns, they proceeded north under the dark of night, directly towards the nation's capital. Little is known of the identities of these fugitives besides their names and gender. All were men, and many of them belonged to some of the most prominent families in Southern Maryland. At least one of them was a free man. 30-year-old Mark Caesar was a literate carpenter who recently had become free upon the death of his owner. After walking almost 2 days and about 40 miles northward through Charles and Prince George's County, the fugitives arrived at the southern shore of the eastern branch of the Potomac River, today's Anacostia River. And you see in the lower right-hand corner here, there are the two bridges. And they first arrive at the lower bridge here on the right. They first arrived on the Maryland side of the Navy Yard Bridge shortly after midnight. But a bridge keeper thwarted their crossing by raising the wooden draw. The group then advanced a quarter mile to the north, where after reaching the southern wharf of the eastern branch bridge, they split into two separate groups. A smaller band of as many as 36 men proceeded along the edge of the eastern branch further into Prince George's County. Whether this group originally intended to enter the District of Columbia or later regretted not doing so is unknown. Nevertheless, the larger contingent of about 40 men crossed the bridge without any resistance. And so so if you look on the map, right where it says Eastern Branch, the large group of 75 men, they arrived where you see the N in Eastern on the southern edge of the Anacostia River. And then the group split into two. and the smaller group just proceeded along the shore north towards Pennsylvania is their goal. But the larger contingent of 40, 50 men, they proceed to the bridge that you see going between the N and the C of the word branch, and they actually cross the river and enter Washington, D.C. The larger contingent of about 40 men crossed the bridge without any resistance. Once they stepped inside the district's borders, they found their way towards 7th Street and continued north, passing within a mile of the United States Capitol, which dominated the landscape with its imposing white neoclassical dome. So, and I used to live on East Capitol Street, and I was about 7 blocks from the nation's capital, and you left my house every morning and you see the dome. And DC was very underpopulated at the time. So as these 40, 50 slaves enter the District of Columbia, they go up 7th Street. They're walking right by the US Capitol, which is pretty profound to imagine. The decision to proceed through the District of Columbia is worth noting. Since long before the Rockville Rebellion, enslaved people had demonstrated their understanding of the paradox of slavery in the very seat of the American government. In one remarkable instance, as slave traders led more than a dozen chained and enslaved people by the US Capitol, congressmen watched in amazement as one of these captives, holding his chains, quote, as high as he could reach, commenced singing the favorite national song, Hail Columbia, Happy Land. In subsequent decades, Hail Columbia, Happy Land, the United States' first national anthem, would become one of the most recognizable mottos of the American abolitionist movement. Consequently, it is easy to imagine that the fugitives who crossed the Eastern Branch Bridge were aware of this prior incident, and that they, like the shackled vocalist, recognized the political symbolism of their march through the national capital of a republic birthed in freedom. Without any proof of their thinking, however, this is impossible to determine. And if you don't know, I should tell you that in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, one of the most famous slave pens in the entire country was in Washington, D.C., several blocks from the U.S. Capitol. And just from the research I have done, I have found that many, many enslaved people in Prince George's and Charles County, even in Port Tobacco, Maryland, had been purchased in Washington, D.C. So it's very likely that a large number of the group of fugitive slaves had already been to Washington, D.C. They knew the way to Washington, D.C. It was local to them. All that can be said for certain is that 30 years later, in July 1845, the sight of dozens of armed Black men marching in column formation behind a sword-wielding William Wheeler spread fear throughout the federal city. Residents in the district's southeastern section fled toward the Navy Yard, where Marine Corps Commandant Archibald Henderson welcomed them inside the compound's walls and established a triple guard around the enclosure. He, moreover, armed the members of a local fire company. By late Monday night on July 7th, as many as 200 residents from Washington and surrounding communities had joined the Marines and firemen in hunting the fugitives down. The collaborative effort of citizens and soldiers to capture the fugitives proved successful. The first arrest occurred on the night of the 7th, when authorities apprehended 4 of the bondsmen inside the district limits. Soon thereafter, a local sheriff rounded up 18 more in nearby Bladensburg, Maryland. These captives belonged to the smaller group of fugitives that decided against crossing the Eastern Branch Bridge and thus had never entered the capital. Events played out differently near Rockville. And if you see here, so the fugitives had gone all the way from Port Tobacco through the District of Columbia, and now they're entering and quickly going to pass Rockville. At dawn on Tuesday, July 8th, the larger contingent of about 40 fugitives pushed past a turnpike gate and continued north on Frederick Road beyond the town. About 20 white men from Washington followed closely behind them on horseback and in buggies, carrying, quote, double-barreled guns and revolving pistols. Several hours later, mounted members of the Montgomery Volunteers, commanded by Captain John Braddock, and a civilian posse led by Rockville Sheriff Daniel Candler, joined the pursuit. Moving north on Frederick Road from Rockville, they surprised the fugitives, who immediately took shelter in the woods nearby. 6 of the volunteers gave chase, expecting a quick and easy surrender. Instead, the fugitives turned rebels and emerged from the woods ready to fight. The result was what one eyewitness called a, quote, grand Negro battle, which began on Benjamin Gaither's farm when Braddock's men surrounded the rebels and demanded an immediate surrender, but the rebels refused. Wheeler ordered his companions to, quote, resist to the last, and they responded by closing ranks and opening fire on their pursuers. When several of their guns malfunctioned, they charged forward with stones and bludgeons until a hail of gunfire forced them to retreat into a swamp. As several of them fell to the ground wounded, 23 others surrendered. The rest, including Wheeler, made off. By the end of the day, officials captured 8 of these individuals, bringing the total number of fugitives secured in the Rockville jail to 31. The fate of all of the Rockville rebels is difficult to determine. A local newspaper published the names of the 31 captives confined in the Rockville jail, along with the names of their owners. Sheriff Candler attached a brief note to the list, requesting the owners come forward and collect their property by paying the appropriate charges. The owners did as instructed, and according to witnesses, the captives were, quote, all marched with chains, handcuffs, etc., and driven through Washington yesterday on the way to their homes. A subsequent manhunt throughout central and western Maryland resulted in the apprehension of 7 other rebels, including Wheeler. When finally confronted by white vigilantes in Howard County, quote, he was armed with a long sword, but suffering for want of food, he made no resistance, end quote. All told, U.S. Marines, militiamen, and ordinary citizens helped arrest and return more than 50 fugitive slaves to their owners. At least 2 of the rebels appear to have died as the result of their wounds, though accounts vary. Here is an actual list of many of the slaves that were captured and incarcerated in Rockville. And here you have a list of the wounded captives, and I'll just read it just at the beginning. But Ferdinand, a slave of William Brawner, slight shot in the left neck. Slave of Edwin Jones, wounded in the back from a rifle shot. Samuel, slightly wounded in the back and face. So clearly this was a very, very violent encounter in Gaithersburg, Maryland. The number of prisoners is important to consider because it substantiates that some of the rebels avoided recapture. Northern newspapers offer additional proof. In late July, several fugitives passed through upstate New York and entered Canada. They were, according to one widely disseminated report, quote, a portion of those 77, it is said in all, who escaped from their pursuers in the recent movement in Maryland, end quote. While some doubted the veracity of the account, an announcement published a week later independently confirmed it. The brief statement read, quote, 9 of the slaves who ran away from Maryland have arrived in Canada, end quote. Regardless of how many of the Rockville rebels reached Canada and became free, the aftershocks of their heroic efforts reverberated far beyond the farms and plantations from where they started. By assaulting slavery in and around the nation's capital, while the smoke and aroma of the fireworks celebrating the 4th of July still floated in the air, these enslaved people proved the United States' failure to fulfill the promises of freedom and equality proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence. At the same time, they offered powerful images of patriotic sacrifice and suffering in the name of these American ideals, which abolitionists then deployed as part of a national argument to end slavery. As soon as news of the violent suppression of the Rockville Rebellion spread, abolitionists adopted one of the most trusted tactics in the fight against slavery, what historian Caleb McDaniel calls the mobilization of patriotic shame. In William Lloyd Garrison's first comments on the episode, the preeminent abolitionist editor offered the violence meted out in Maryland as another example, quote, of the oppressive and bloody deeds which are daily perpetrated in the South, end quote. Garrison wondered how anyone could read of the heroic effort of these enslaved people to become free following the 4th of July, and the manner in which they were captured and marched through Washington in chains, quote, without being ashamed of the American name. An anonymous New Englander sharing Garrison's view argued that the mistreatment of the Rockville rebels revealed how the young republic had forsaken its foundational ideals by shamefully serving slave owners' interest. In a public letter, the writer explained that these runaways were human beings, quote, born with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Consequently, they were perfectly justified in running away from their owners, having lived under the very shadow of the lofty porches of freedom's own temple, the Capitol at Washington. It was to be expected that these Black captives, quote, longed to taste that liberty which they every day heard was the inalienable right of every man. The use of federal soldiers to shoot, capture, and kill these people was particularly troubling, for the victims were, quote, men of inalienable rights, their right to escape from their masters perfect and unquestionable. In an angry article called Liberty or Death, a New York editorialist expressed similar frustration with the American government's shameful pro-slavery position. The article reminded readers how only days earlier, citizens across the Republic had celebrated national independence, quote, with cannon, bonfires, pistols, and firecrackers. Orators had praised the Union of States as the land of the free and the home of the brave. Christian ministers offered up thanks for the freedom of the people, while millions listened to a reading of the Declaration of Independence. Clearly, then, Americans had good reason to be proud that 4th of July. Yet something was amiss. For among those who had heard the bomb blast and the flowery orations were the Rockville rebels. Quote, they listened and were convinced. The national sentiment coincided with theirs exactly, end quote. But their situations ran counter to the nation's noble sentiments. Their friends and family were property, quote, mere chattels, liable to be bought, sold, swapped, flogged, branded, kicked, cuffed, and outraged at the caprice of those deniers and contemners of the truths asserted by Jefferson in 1776. As enslaved people, the rebels could not fight for their inalienable rights as the founding fathers did so gloriously, it is said, every 4th of July, because they lacked all of the advantages of their oppressors. Their only hope was to escape to the north, where the Declaration of Independence still echoed. An evangelical Bostonian appealed to a higher authority when defending the Rockville rebels. He recalled that the founding fathers dedicated themselves to liberty or death, and for this they have been immortalized in song and story and on the grave page of history. But the revolutionary right they asserted was not the result of education, ancestry, or even color. It was a gift of God. And it was as truly the gift of God to the slave who sweltered on the plantation as it was to George Washington or Patrick Henry. The recent battle near the nation's capital was just as justifiable by the law of human rights as was the Battle of Bunker Hill or Yorktown. In this case, the gallant defenders of their rights did not intend to harm anyone. Quote, they only wished to go quietly away from a crushing bondage, and in attempting to go, they wronged no man, no man. Like the founding fathers, they refused to submit to their enslavers, and by offering their blood for freedom, only, quote, obeyed the undying instincts of humanity. Given the revolutionary motivations of the Rockville rebels, the writer warned of the danger facing the entire republic should slavery continue to exist. And he writes, quote, our 4th of July celebrations are not unknown to them. Our glad huzzahs are wafted to the ears, and what? If hearing the sound and catching the spirit of our national rejoicings, they should determine to be as free as we, and should rise to execute their will. Their future was clear. Aware of their natural rights, enslaved Americans would adopt the same doctrines held dear by the founding fathers, and in order to protect their lives and that of their families, take freedom in their own bloody hands. In his defense of the Rockville rebels, James Russell Lowell joined the abolitionist tactics of patriotic shaming and appealing to a higher power. The Massachusetts poets' anti-slavery attitudes were still relatively new when he learned of the men that he christened the, quote, disciples of the Declaration, who, while escaping from bondage near the nation's capital, were subjected to an act of, quote, unparalleled inhumanity, which the national media largely ignored. Russell says, quote, it seems strange that a burst of indignation from one end of our free country to the other did not follow so atrocious a deed. At least, it seemed a proper occasion for sympathy on the part of our daily newspapers, which a year or two ago endorsed the Revolutionary War era mantra that those who would be free themselves must strike the blow. Lowell abhorred violence, but the bravery of these Black rebels moved him to compose an impassioned anti-slavery poem. Highlighting the hypocrisy of American patriotism, the rhyming couplets condemn those who worship the revolutionary freedom fighters buried recently beneath the earth's surface, the rhyming couplets condemn those who worship the revolutionary freedom fighters buried beneath the earth's surface, while ignoring those who still walked upon it. So here's just an excerpt from it. He says, shame on the costly mockery of piling stone on stone to those who won our liberty, the heroes dead and gone. While we look coldly on and see law shielding ruffians slay the men who fain would win their own, the heroes of today. Man is more than constitutions, and here Lowell is referring to a higher power. Man is more than constitutions, better rot beneath the sod than be true to church and state while we are doubly false to God. We owe allegiance to the state, but deeper, truer, more, to the sympathies that God hath set within our spirit's core. Our country claims our fealty. We grant it so, but then, before man made us citizens, great nature made us men. The poem struck a chord, appearing widely in abolitionist and anti-slavery publications for the next 2 decades. Extensive coverage of the Rockville Rebellion in local and national newspapers demonstrates the political power of enslaved people, especially as it relates to the rise of American abolitionism. Fugitive slaves were the abolition movement's, quote, most effective emissaries, Manisha Sinha writes in her comprehensive history of the movement. In the case of the Rockville rebels, they were also rank and file soldiers on the front lines of the growing sectional battle over American freedom. Consequently, their story adds to the burgeoning historiography on the 19th century Black struggle to both end slavery and secure civil rights. Still, because of the entrenched power of white supremacy, slavery's defenders refused to credit the Rockville rebels for inspiring abolitionists and instead argued that the reverse had taken place, that abolitionists inspired the slaves. Not surprisingly, in the pro-slavery publications that these assertions appeared, the fact that the rebellion originated on Independence Day weekend went unmentioned. An editorialist in the Georgetown section of the nation's capital confessed the conspiracy was daringly conceived. But because of slaves' inherent submissiveness, he believed that Northern philanthropists, quote, had a hand in bringing about this business. More than 1,000 miles away from Washington, an incensed Louisianan divulged, whom he held responsible for the Rockville Rebellion when he demanded, quote, hang the abolitionists and whip the Negroes until they are sick of it, end quote. I should add that this article has recently, or this essay I'm reading today is part of an article that has been accepted for publication, but in the process of getting it published and read by outside reviewers, several reviewers were adamant that I point to or find or locate evidence of abolitionist assistance. And I just don't find it. These slaves acted on their own, and that's the only argument that can be said about it. It had nothing to do with abolitionists from what the evidence tells. Despite white Southerners' fears of abolitionist interlopers, the Rockville rebels appear to have acted on their own. Regardless, that did not stop their owners and other pro-slavery Marylanders from holding a series of public meetings in the wake of the rebellion, where they blamed foreigners, white Northerners, and free Black Southerners for the affair. According to an ad hoc committee organized at a large gathering in front of the Port Tobacco Courthouse, these congregations were the direct result of, quote, having watched with deep concern the tendency of the late movement of foreign governments and the reckless efforts of fanaticism in the northern portion of the US to subvert the institutions of the state of Maryland. Given recent events, it was clear that abolitionists intended to, quote, invade the peace of our people by the sacrifice of our property at the risk of our lives and the destruction of our constitutional rights, end quote. Besides that, a rising population of free Black men and women represented a, quote, growing evil that required immediate redress. The pro-slavery assemblies, in which any references to the rebellion having occurred on the 4th of July weekend were conspicuously absent, resulted in the adoption of a series of published resolutions. Though variations existed, the intent of the resolves was always the same, quote, to adopt rules and regulations that will effectually counteract the causes which instigate the slaves to elope and the means by which many of them do escape, end quote. The proposals generally encouraged an increase of law enforcement resources and the further restriction of the rights of enslaved people. The most radical encouraged policymakers to secure legislation that would permanently banish free Black people from the state. In the end, state and local administrators made few of the recommended changes. While the presence of slave patrols increased in some areas, proposed legislation to remove free Black people from the state failed for a number of reasons, most of them economic. Owing to the preservation of the status quo, a disgruntled former Maryland assemblyman, Walter Miller, recommended the increased oppression of enslaved people. After all, he submitted, unchecked abolitionism made it, quote, necessary for the master to draw tighter the ligatures of slavery, and finally to sever the cord which binds them together and consigns the slave to a more ungenial clime and a less compassionate taskmaster. Whether any slave owners heeded Miller's advice is unknown, but the process repeatedly played itself out across the South. When slaveholders cracked down in the aftermath of revolts and revolt scares, writes historian Walter Johnson, quote, they treated slave revolts as if they could be ended more by vigilance or more mastery on the part of white people, as if, that is to say, those revolts were aspects of their own agency, end quote. Almost incapable of acknowledging the potential of the people they held in captivity, quote, they responded to, without ever fully imagining, the politics of Black revolt, end quote. Further evidence of the political impact of the Rockville Rebellion came in late August 1845, when the Charles County Court formally charged William Wheeler and Charles Caesar, the rebellion's two alleged ringleaders, with the capital crime of inciting a slave insurrection. In two separate trials, a veritable who's who of Maryland's most powerful public officials volunteered their services. Among them were several former and current state assemblymen and two state senators. The trials occurred in September 1845. Wheeler's, which went first, lasted only 2 days. Based on the testimony of several witnesses, a, quote, fair and impartial jury reached a verdict of guilty after only a brief absence from the courtroom. The court then sentenced the defendant to death by hanging. Caesar's trial came next. It lasted a week, though a lengthy adjournment similarly left only 2 days for testimony. In this case, after hours of deliberation, the 12-man jury was unable to reach a consensus and thus found the defendant not guilty. There were two reasons for Caesar's acquittal. First was a dispute over the technical construction of an 1809 law defining the word insurrection. Caesar's lawyers argued that, quote, the meeting of Negroes with arms in their hands to run away was not an insurrectionary movement within the meaning of the statute, end quote. Therefore, the defendant could not be convicted of such a crime. Second was the question of Caesar's freedom, which the court ultimately admitted after reviewing the will of his recently deceased owner. Under the presumption that the common law protection of double jeopardy did not apply to African Americans, the Charles County Court immediately impaneled a new jury and 2 weeks later retried Caesar for aiding and abetting fugitive slaves. This time, the jury found him guilty of 10 separate counts of the charge, each of which carried a sentence of 4 years, making the entire length of his imprisonment 40 years. Having failed in his effort to free others from slavery, Caesar spent 5 years in Baltimore's penitentiary before dying of consumption in 1850. Wheeler experienced a far different fate. While awaiting his execution in the Port Tobacco jail, a memorial, signed by a number of prominent citizens, arrived on the desk of Governor Thomas Pratt. The petition called on the state's chief executive to reduce Wheeler's sentence to life imprisonment. In his annual message to the General Assembly in December 1845, Pratt confessed that he also wanted to modify the prisoner's sentence. However, existing laws prohibited from taking such action in cases involving slaves. Pratt asked the Assembly to take the necessary steps to allow the state penitentiary to receive the convicted rebel into its custody and confine him for the rest of his life. 3 months later, the Maryland legislature did just that. While there are several possible explanations for the governor's and other prominent slave owners' desire to commute a rebellious fugitive slave's death sentence, one, which had nothing to do with any concern over Wheeler's well-being, stands out. In the first half of the 19th century, as the sectional gulf between the northern and southern states widened, white Southerners expanded their efforts to ensure the future of their most profitable and peculiar institution. Eager to convince outsiders of slavery's positive good, they tried to suppress and even eliminate examples of extreme violence against enslaved people. Given the widespread coverage of the Rockville Rebellion in the Northern press, it is not at all surprising that Maryland's pro-slavery political leaders preferred to see Wheeler's body safely secured behind the bars of a concealed prison cell rather than dangling lifelessly from the public gallows. That being said, Wheeler had no intention of spending the rest of his life behind bars or hanging from a noose. Just days after the General Assembly passed the law allowing Wheeler's incarceration in the Baltimore City jail, which caused Governor Pratt to officially commute the prisoner's death sentence, the Port Tobacco Times published an announcement. And this is the actual announcement here. And it reads, on Saturday night last, Negro Bill Wheeler, convicted of insurrection during the last term of late August court and sentenced to be hung, but whose sentence, by a special act of the legislature, was remitted to imprisonment in the penitentiary during his natural life, broke from the jail of the sheriff of this county and made his escape. There has been a reward of $100 offered for his apprehension and delivery to the sheriff of this county. As we see, the local sheriff offered a $100 reward for Wheeler's capture, but it appears that the prize went uncollected. The absence of Wheeler's name in subsequent editions of the paper and other local contemporary sources suggests that this disciple of the Declaration achieved liberty over death. Though largely forgotten, the Fugitive Slave Rebellion at Rockville is important to remember, as is the outpouring of abolitionist publications that it inspired. By freeing from captivity, enslavement over the 4th of July weekend, the Rockville rebels revealed the American people's failure to extend the rights enunciated in the Declaration of Independence to all people. At the same time, these rebels provided powerful images of patriotic sacrifice and suffering, which abolitionists eagerly exploited in their radical crusade to end slavery. In so doing, these rebels and their allies joined a revolutionary political tradition that challenged both the nature and meaning of American freedom. Thank you all.
Great, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. So now we have time for question and answer. If you have a question, please feel free to use the Q&A or the chat to express your question, and I will be happy to read it to Dr. Clavin. Okay, so the first question is from JWJI fellow Barbara Combs. Thank you so much for your talk. 2 questions. 1, why do you think your reviewers are so insistent and consistent in their suggestion that abolitionists assisted in the rebellion and that it wasn't just slaves acting. And two, she notes that in her own research, she finds patterns of pushback against Black or slave advancement. How did the community respond to Wheeler's escape?
I'll answer the second part first because that's easier. I have found no discussion, no evidence of anything responding to Wheeler's escape. I can't tell you how many hours, days, and weeks I've spent trying to track down William Wheeler. And I've searched Civil War records, District of Columbia local records. You know, Port Tobacco was a little tiny town in Charles County, Maryland. It essentially doesn't exist any longer. And the courthouse is still there, or a version of the courthouse, but all the documents were moved to the Maryland State Archives years ago, and I've gone through them exhaustively. Bottom line, there is no discussion that I've seen. There is, in the 1850s, one Maryland congressman who gives a speech, and he's fearful of abolitionism, and he refers back to the events of 1845, but that's really it. It's almost like the incident is sort of swept under the rug. And in fact, in the Maryland State Archives, I believe the court records were sort of swept under the rug by Marylanders in the 19th century, because you have all these court documents from the year of 1845, but in August and September, when the trials occur, it's completely blank. And so just whatever documentation was there was erased or silenced by someone, probably for very obvious reasons. Regarding the first question, now there's a legitimate claim that Washington, D.C. was an abolitionist mecca, and make no mistake about it. Charles Torrey, very famously, was a white abolitionist, and he worked with all these predominantly free Black men and women in the nation's capital at this time period to help hundreds of fugitive slaves escape to the North in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. So there's a very legitimate reason to search for abolitionist assistance. But I also still think there's just this notion among scholars and lay people alike that antebellum slaves were very sort of unaware and unknowledgeable, and just they didn't have the wherewithal of fugitives. And in my very first book on Toussaint Louverture, one of my favorite things I ever found as a historian regarding primary source evidence was a fugitive slave during the Civil War was carrying a trunk, and these Northern soldiers are assisting him, and he opens up the trunk, and there's a pamphlet of the Haitian Revolution in his trunk. And it's just like to imagine a slave in the antebellum South who owns a pamphlet telling the history of the Haitian Revolution is still, to me, and I found that 20 years ago, it still blows my mind. And so it's like there's all this evidence that enslaved people, they knew exactly what the 4th of July was about. They knew exactly what the Declaration of Independence was. They listened to those orations. And so in the defense of the historian's craft, right? I mean, to make an argument and to argue anything and prove it with evidence in the historical community, it has to be, you have to have concrete evidence, right? It's not the internet. You can't just say stuff. And so part of it is historians just making sure I do my due diligence and seek out those abolitionists. But there's also the other part where people just still have, the assumption is that these enslaved people were kind of clueless to what was going on around them nationally and even internationally. And the more I read, the more I research, I find that this is just simply not the case. But great questions, by the way. Thanks.
So I have a follow-up question to one of Barbara's questions. So we don't see it sort of in sort of evidence that people discuss Wheeler in the written record. I don't know if this is beyond the scope of your research, but do you find evidence in sort of artifacts of popular culture, for instance, where there are folk songs, where there are kind of oral histories that were kind of out there that maybe got passed along from generation to generation?
I haven't found any like hard copies of things, but what you have is a long list of really fugitive slaves who recall, like some of the quotations I read about William and Ellen Craft, Frederick Douglass, very famously, William Wells Brown, Harriet Tubman. So these fortunate fugitives, the ones who actually make it out and document their history, they are the ones who report that all of this stuff was very knowledgeable in the communities that they lived in and things of that nature. And I also mentioned, before our talk, that there are examples I found of fugitive slaves who, while they are escaping, they are quoting Patrick Henry. Slaves, while they are rebelling, are crying out liberty or death. Sometimes they cry out death or liberty. Harriet Tubman famously confessed that while she was enslaved, that she was guaranteed to one or two things, and one of them was death or liberty. And so these enslaved people are quoting the founding fathers. And for me, that's the best evidence that I could find out there.
Thank you. So the next question is from JWJI fellow Francine Allen. Thank you for the fascinating discussion about the Rockville Rebellion. As you mentioned, there was no indication that the efforts of the rebels were supported by abolitionists. Is there evidence of support given to the rebels by any Black organizations, particularly the nascent Black church? Also, despite the crackdown on Black revolt after the Rockville Rebellion, did the rebellion change or impact specifically how the 4th of July was celebrated in Rockville, perhaps to stave off future rebellion?
Great question. Again, I'll answer it backwards because number 2 is a little bit easier. No, they continue to celebrate the 4th of July as normal in Charles County, Maryland. Now, I will tell you that throughout the South, by the end of the 1850s, and there's some famous instances in places like Charleston, South Carolina, where they're talking about banning Black people from these public celebrations. Now, they had talked about this in as early as the 18 teens, I recall seeing. But by the 1850s, white Southerners are not only, I don't remember if they actually do it, but they're certainly talking about banning enslaved people from 4th of July observations. But they themselves are actually not celebrating the 4th of July like they used to. They're not celebrating it for the same reasons. And it's really become less important than, whereas it's still a big deal in the North. It's a much less celebrated a holiday in the South by the end of the 1850s, by the eve of the Civil War. And then the first question was, were these fugitive slaves, did they get any other assistance from Black organizations or Black churches? Again, the answer is I haven't found any evidence of that at all. And I think so many instances of these mass escapes or these fugitive slave rebellions, when they become these violent encounters, it usually just appears to be a handful of slaves have had enough. Something in particular might set them off, like an impending sale. Some people would probably argue that the reason slaves escape on the 4th of July is apolitical because the owners are drunk or the owners are distracted. I'm sure that's true, but it happens too often for it to be completely apolitical. And given what I have found about, slaves' awareness of the Declaration and the 4th of July, I do think it's at least partly political. They're doing this as a political statement. And so, no, I don't find any evidence of any outside assistance. It's just these 50, 60, as many as 75 slaves on their own deciding, let's get out of here. And obviously, by them going directly north to the Pennsylvania border, they are aware of the Underground Railroad. They are aware that if you cross the Mason-Dixon line, you are free. So there is even additional evidence. The fact that they follow the path they do, they know that there is a path to freedom in the 1840s in the antebellum South, and it's northward. Even if you have to go through the nation's capital, even if you have to pass the Navy Yard.
Let me ask a follow-up question here as well. And so what are the stats on people running away or insurrections on other holidays like Christmas, where you could expect people would be so satiated that they might not, notice if something is happening? So is it that we're seeing more activity around the 4th of July than we're seeing around other holidays where there could be an opportunistic reason for people to try to escape or revolt?
Thank you for that, because you have just given me something that I need to address. Because no, you don't see slaves running away on Christmas, running away on, and I mean, it happens for sure, but I don't think to the rate that, like you said, we see an increase around the 4th of July. And, Frederick Douglass and other escaped slaves, they oftentimes talk about these holidays. And there's like the harvest holiday in the fall. There's the Christmas holiday. There can be the New Year's holiday. There can be an Easter holiday. There's the 4th of July holiday. And these slaves recall that there were games. There were events. I found all sorts of, there's athletic events on the 4th of July that slaves participate in. But ultimately, it does not appear to me, and I would have to go back and sort of quantify it, right? It does not appear that Christmas, for example, inspires the same number, or the same type of escapes. Yeah, I have seen countless runaway slave advertisements where over Christmas holidays, one or two bondspeople escape, or they don't escape, but they flee to get back to other family members. You know, they use the opportunity to track down, you know, children or spouses or parents, things of that nature. But regarding these mass rebellions, what historians now call fugitive slave rebellions, it seems like 4th of July is attracting them, and definitely the slave revolts of Nat Turner and others. I mean, they're and John Brown's. They're planning these things for the 4th of July. Never Christmas, never New Year's, never Harvest Day. So that is an idea that really is important to what something I need to consider moving forward.
Great, thanks. So another question from Barbara Combs, and so she's providing a bit of context information. So the JWJI fellows do talk with the speaker before the event, and she was wondering if you might be willing to share with the rest of the webinar attendees about how you got into this work and why you think that white scholars and white people in general should care about this research area.
You know, I was just reading something last night. I won't tell you the author, and it's not known, but the author had said how, you know, she was just discussing this scholarship on race and things of that nature, and how today it appears that all of these scholars are people of color, which is fantastic. We need more people of color in positions of power and authority. We need more Black sports organization owners. We need more Black CEOs. We need more Black professors and all that stuff. But we certainly don't ever want to get to a place where all of the scholars of race and all the scholars of Black history or Hispanic history or Asian history are people of color. I think we just need to have smart people who are passionate and knowledgeable about it to tell not only American history, but world history. And, you know, it's interesting, you know, being a white man in America, you know, it's very different to how people identify themselves. And I have long identified myself as sort of like non-racial, right? This is the way a lot of white Americans think. They think that they don't belong to a race. They don't want to think in racial terms. But my study of history has forced me to reckon with, you know, we all know there are Black people, there are white people, there are Hispanic people, police departments, police officers, they look at people and they make a determination. That person is white, I'm going to treat them that way. That person is Black, I'm going to treat them that way. So I told the panelists before the actual presentation that my background, I'm from Maryland, from Baltimore, grew up in a very cosmopolitan part of the world. And it really wasn't until I moved to the north in Pennsylvania in college that I really met stone cold white racist. And it was very sort of world shattering to me. And even before then, I thought I would get involved in history and never thought I'd be a professor until I got to, you know, undergraduate studies, towards the end of my undergraduate studies. But race and racism have just, for whatever reason, a lot of it's, I can't explain. I have just been obsessed with the study of it. I have been in love with the book To Kill a Mockingbird since I was a kid, right? And I even thought of naming my daughter Scout at one point, and she thanks me today that I didn't. But, you know, there's just this idea in American history that race is the American problem, as Du Bois and others have said. But like in To Kill a Mockingbird, you had this idea that children or young people aren't racist, right? That racism is taught to people. And that's how I felt growing up. Like, no one taught me to be racist. I didn't see racism, so I wasn't racist. It wasn't a choice I made. I didn't grow up in a racist community. I didn't grow up in a racist family. There wasn't racism. And then I went to college, of all places, and found racism. And it hurt, man. It hurt really, really bad. And I haven't recovered, which is why I still do this on a daily basis. So it's very personal to me, and I think it's very important moving forward that everybody needs to be involved in the discussion of race, the teaching of race, the study of race and the learning of race. That's very important if we want to see any progress at all.
Thank you. So this question is from Haley Harrell, who's our third JWJI fellow. Thank you for your talk. I'm always interested in how studying our historical past can make our present seem strange or feel strange. How do you think your archival research on fugitive slaves can help unsettle certain assumptions we had in the present about slavery and about Black forms of resistance?
I think first and foremost, I think people still largely unappreciate how resistant enslaved people were. And for a variety of reasons, my scholarship typically focuses on the rebellions and the runaways. But as we all know, anyone who studies slavery, there are the everyday acts of resistance, which are just as important, maybe more important historically. So first and foremost, I just think people don't appreciate how resistant Black people were to captivity. And I think that's a very, you can't begin to understand slavery until you realize that there was this huge national institution, and then it became a regional or sectional institution where everything was organized to keep these people down, like to oppress them. But you can't begin to understand that and realize how it plays out until you acknowledge that these people fought back on a daily basis for centuries. And I think my scholarship in particular shows, and I don't want to go too far with this, but there are many occasions where these resistors had help from free Black people, from poor white people, from abolitionists 1,000 miles away. You know, during the War of 1812, it was the British military. During the Civil War, it was the Union Army. During the American Revolution, it was the British. So, I mean, it's very complicated, but I just think the idea of resistance has been lost. And while it's, as I've made clear, it's predominantly these enslaved people taking their destiny or trying to take their destiny into their own hands. I got to tell you, there's a lot of people who don't like slavery in the 19th century. There's a lot of people in the 19th century who do not like white supremacy. There's a lot of people back then who resist slavery. There's a lot of people back then who resist white supremacy. And I always get a little upset when I have students tell me, but the founding fathers, you know, everybody was racist. Everybody owned slaves. We all know that's clearly not true. Not every white American owned slaves. In fact, a minority did. Not every American was an advocate of white supremacy. And it's sort of like today. You can't look at anyone and say that they're this way or that way. History is complicated. And so I just think people need to sort of recalibrate what America must have been like during an age of slavery. You had all these institutional powers that ruled, quite frankly, for generations. But the entire time, there was pushback from people on plantations, from abolitionists up north, from abolitionists in England. And it's a, I don't want to use the word war, but it's a never-ending battle over freedom. And so I just think we need to understand that as we're learning today, right, freedom is not free. That doesn't just mean we have to go overseas and fight wars. It means we got to fight on election day, not literally, but we need to go to the polls. And if we have to wait in line, and there's people there with guns now, and there's bad weather, and there's all this stuff, but you have to fight for freedom. And so I think sometimes just the fight gets lost. And so that's something that I think still holds today. We can take a lot of inspiration from people who were given so little chance of success and the pursuit of happiness. And we have so many more advantages, but we got a long way to go. And if we just sit back and watch, then very, very bad things can happen. So we got to get out there and we have to be active, just like they were active hundreds of years ago.
So one comment. Please respond to this, sort of, if you will. As Charles Mill said, all whites are not signatories to the racial contract, but all whites are beneficiaries of it. So how does that fit into your story of complexity? So this question is from Barbara.
I'm not sure what they mean, what Barbara means.
Feel free to sort of chime in if you want. But what I'm saying is that while, yes, there were clearly people who were resistant to it, There's certainly people who couldn't afford to be a part of it. But this in some ways could have remained could have been an aspiration for some people, even if it was beyond their reach. And there certainly were other benefits to it, whether you traded in industries that, were directly linked to slavery, even if you didn't actually own the means of production and other kinds of things.
Right. Yeah, but I don't think, at least my feeling is the people, listen, I don't want to make this sound like we had a large percentage of white Americans in the 19th century thinking that white supremacy was a fallacy, that racial equality was the goal. Clearly, that was not the case, right? I am talking about a small group of white Americans who did not benefit from slavery in any way, shape, or form. I mean, you can't say that. They benefited from the racial construction of whiteness. So I'm thinking like William Lloyd Garrison, right? So William Lloyd Garrison benefits from being a white man in a white republic. But at the same time, he dedicates his entire life to getting rid of slavery immediately. And he's fighting for women's rights. He's fighting for racial equality and voting rights and all that stuff. And, he's an exception to the rule, but there's a lot of, there's plenty of white Americans in the 19th century, especially in the 1850s after the Fugitive Slave Law. They are dedicating their lives to ending slavery, right? And then during the Civil War, there's white soldiers who are dying to end slavery. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And so I think that, white privilege was prominent back then. It is prominent today, but that's still, just because all white people benefit from the privilege of whiteness, I still think we can't forget that a lot of them still fought for Black people. And I think that's just important to remember. It's not the whole story by any means, and they are a small group of people, but in that small group of people, we can find inspiration to sort of challenge existing norms today.
Right.
I hope that answers the comment.
Yes. Are there any more questions? Okay. Well, seeing none, I want to thank Dr. Clavin for his talk. We really appreciate it. Oh, looks like we did have one more, and I missed it. Okay, so this is from Francine. You mentioned that there came a point in which fugitives became rebels. I find the wording of that interesting because because I think of the act of escaping slavery as a kind of rebellion. How are you distinguishing between rebel behavior and fugitive behavior?
Yeah, this is complicated stuff. And like I said, when I try to get this article published, you get a lot of, not pushback, but just feedback. And so I had to choose these words very carefully. And I don't even remember where I started now, but where I ended was, and you could absolutely, I think normally I would call, a large group of slaves who run away together, I guess I wouldn't call that a rebellion. Even if they're, but if they're carrying weapons, I think you could go either way. But what I've chosen to do for this study is that when fugitive slaves engage in a violent clash with their, the people who are trying to capture them, then it becomes a rebellion. And I think I'm going back to Herbert Aptheker and his definition of a slave revolt. He said it's like 10 or more slaves and it's armed uprising and things of that nature. So there's a long history of slave revolts. And so there's a lot of, if you read William Stills's Underground Railroad, there are just many examples of fugitive slaves who escape armed or unarmed, and I would not call that a rebellion or a revolt. It is a mass escape. But I think when those slaves do resort to violence to get their freedom and to defend themselves, call that a rebellion, though I could be persuaded that it is not rebellion. These terms are important, but changing. And so I still have not decided concretely, but most historians, and I'm thinking of Sinha here, she refers to these large mass escapes that you have violence erupt as fugitive slave rebellions. And so you have the fugitive slave component of a slave rebellion, which is sort of different from a slave revolt, which is just sort of slaves rising up in unison and resorting to violence. whereas a fugitive slave rebellion implies movement, right? Geography across space, and they're armed and they engage in violence with their oppressors.
Okay, thanks so much. Okay. Um, great. Well, are there any other questions? Okay, well, I know you can't hear us, Dr. Clavin, but please join me in thanking Dr. Clavin for his talk. And we look forward to seeing you back here next week. So thanks so much and take care.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.